World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is broadcast number 471, December the 20th, 1980. I began and closed the broadcast last week with a song by John Lennon and the Beatles. And I'd like to do that again for this week and the next week with some feelings or impressions I have about the Beatles. So we'll play one more song now. And then we'll begin with the second part of the expose of the assassination of John Lennon and go into the smoking gun. Okay, now we'll get back to the bulk of the broadcast. And as I say, last week I talked about John Lennon, his political views, his controversial lifestyle, impressions, and memories of the Beatles. And this evening I want to talk about the methods used to conceal political assassinations and some of the evidence for a smoking gun. And for those writers and researchers who are taking these tapes, they can proceed and assist me in looking into this further. Before I get into the smoking gun, I do want to mention that Herb Caen had a column in the San Francisco Chronicle this last week, I believe it was Thursday, and there was a letter from Paul Krasner to Herb Caen that he published in the Chronicle. And for those of you who don't live in the Bay Area or the West Coast, I just want to pass it on. Paul Krasner wrote to Herb Caen and mentioned that meeting John Lennon, he said, fused coincidence with mysticism forever. In the early 60s, when Yoko Ono was struggling avant-garde artist who didn't know the Beatles from a B-52, she had some absurd theater project where customers got inside of huge black cloth bags on a shift in a restaurant, and I gave her the last few $1,000s of my savings. I always was an impulse shopper. Then in 1972, I published the Watergate issue of my underground paper, The Realist, with Mae Brussell's article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped?, documenting a conspiracy involving Richard Nixon, John Mitchell, L. Patrick Gray, and others. I had proofread it at the printer, who wouldn't put it to bed until I gave them a $5,000 cashier's check. I left the printer confident, got home, and the phone rang. It was Yoko. She was in town with John. We all went to the bank and got $5,000 cash, and the presses rolled. I realized that everyone is the star of his own memories, but I thought you'd enjoy this reminder in lieu of a Christmas card. Now, last week I talked about the tragedy of Lennon, and I want to go into the exemplification of some of the motives for shooting him, and then, as I say, into the chain of command that I think we should follow seriously. November the 2nd, 1980, on this radio station, I mentioned in that broadcast that rock musicians would have a hard time with the Ronald Reagan administration. That was based upon the fact that Reagan's team have been put into power by the strong church group, the church that resents the remarks that John Lennon made about Jesus, that the Young Americans for Freedom that hate the rock musicians, the Birch Society that was part of the assassination teams and helped put Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon into power, have been against the anti-war stance of the rock musicians, the dropout culture, the do-it-your-own thing. The very people that supported Ronald Reagan's presidency are very much against the rock music scene. And I gave some examples on that tape and warned that this would be a very hard time for those people expressing their feelings about the world. Well, just the Sunday before John Lennon's murder, December the 2nd, in the Washington Post, some of you don't take the Post, there was an article, and it was a full half-page article, with a picture of people standing over a bonfire in, this is in Minneapolis, and it's called Witness of Fire. This is December the 2nd, and John Lennon was dead 6 days later, on the 8th of December. The Washington Post ran a story by a man named Tom Zito that begins, "Praise the Lord," and then they grit their teeth with copies of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The Beatles are dead, and it shows a $50,000 bonfire of music, of rock music. Praise the Lord. and they smashed. The very first record was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This group that are burning the $50,000 worth of records are the Zion Christian Life Center. A pastor, Leroy Peters, has a band of what he calls 100 Christians, and they've put up money, $10,000 and another $50,000. Two brothers became pastors in 1968. 1966 was when the Beatles had their last concert here, but were already afraid for their life because of the remarks of Jesus and their anti-war stance at that time period as we escalated the Vietnam War. Now, this was 69 was the summer of Woodstock and Altamont and the Manson, Sharon Tate murders, the Manson family, and so forth. But this church was started at this time, and it has a group of people that want to pass the torch on to a new generation. In the article, it says the torch passed to a new generation. Well, the torch was a symbol of John Kennedy, and that torch was taken over by E. Howard Hunt and Douglas Caddy and Young Americans for Freedom, people behind the assassination teams, as a mockery to John Kennedy's inauguration speech and to the symbolism that he wanted. So this group said the torch will be passed to a new generation, meaning them. And then Southern preachers got up and condemned the gyrating pelvis of Elvis Presley. And as I say, the article says very clearly on December the 2nd, 1980, the Beatles are dead, and a quotation, I know personally that Jesus is still alive, but the Beatles are dead. And the article goes on that they compare Satan to rock musicians, and they're going throughout the country. They've been down at Lafayette, Louisiana, and they're rounding up thousands of dollars in rock and roll records and putting them up in smoke. And they're selling tape cassettes on the evils of rock and roll and Satan and making fun of the musicians. There's a quotation about George Harrison and My Sweet Lord and Janis Joplin and Alan Parsons and Jimi Hendrix, just criticizing all of those musicians. And the article compares the fire to Nazi Germany, the burning of the books in Nazi Germany, that they have collected 50,000 and another 10,000 to destroy rock music. But the symbolism of the Washington Post story with the big flame, witness of fire putting the torch to thousands of rock. And then after that December 2nd article on December the 10th, Conrad had a cartoon in the Los Angeles Times that was apropos, and it shows three Beatles standing with a vacant space saying Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The Sunday before John Lennon was murdered, there was a full-page picture of him in a supplement of the Los Angeles Times, but there also was a picture of Mr. Blady, who's in Hollywood writing some very successful movies. I mentioned William Blady last week because he worked under the auspices of Georgetown University, and in Beirut, Lebanon, and was head of the United States, a mind control section of the United States military. He's the man who wrote The Exorcist. He's now in Hollywood, putting out several movies, The Ninth Configuration and Twinkle, Twinkle, Killer Kane. I think of Citizen Kane and Orson Welles. He has $2.3 million that he just put in a recent movie. But that's the man that I mentioned who was very much into mind control in Beirut, Lebanon, and I'll do more about Beirut in a little while. But Witness of Fire is a scary thing to see just 6 days before Lennon was actually murdered. I mentioned last week that when we solve these crimes or try to solve them, we have to contend with a news media that admittedly has 400 agents working for the CIA. This came out at the time of the Senate Church Committee. So this last week, there were headlines of the usual cover story, and I don't want to deal with all of those tonight. I just want to go into the evidence of where to look for a conspiracy. But one of the typical kinds of stories coming out of New York newspaper was the Jimmy Breslin article, The Future Belongs to the Good Shot. That just came out in today's paper. And he talks about the Good Shot group, Mark David Chapman, how he belted out John Lennon with 4 in the chest. The 4 were so close together that people at the morgue got them mixed up, getting the entrance wounds. Good shot group. That's what they call it, the firing range, the experts, to describe the way Chapman's handgun shooting of Lennon took place in New York City. Certainly, it must be said that nobody was happy about John Lennon being dead. But at the same time, the gun people did see some hope rising from the tragedy. What impressed them was the good shot group, the way he hit his mark and got it. This is Breslin going on. He said Chapman, with no military background at all, held the gun firmly with both hands and dropped it into the same great crouch preferred by FBI agents and David Berkowitz. If Chapman, an ordinary unschooled citizen shooting under pressure, perhaps for the first time in his life could do so well, then certainly he could be used as a model, and gun owners over the nation could be urged to emulate his accuracy. Now, what the point I want to bring out about this article is that Breslin is telling us that with no background at all, that Mark David Chapman could shoot so accurately at John Lennon. What gives him the idea that with all the missing places that Chapman was at, he wasn't trained to shoot? He spent 6 months in Beirut, Lebanon. Does Breslin know what he was doing there? That was the place where the Israeli athletes' murder plan was arranged in Beirut, Lebanon. There were people from Beirut, Lebanon that I'll go into directly linked to the Georgia location of this Chapman fellow for 18 months between when he got out of high school before he went to Lebanon. Lebanon is the nurturing place of Frank Turple of the CIA and George Corcola of the CIA, and arms are sent there for terrorism, for assassination, for killing Jews around the world, for bombing synagogues, and also rock musicians could fall into that category. As I say, the training place for the killing the athletes in Munich in 1972 was done in Beirut, Lebanon. So out of Atlanta, Georgia, and Marietta, Georgia, goes Mark David Chapman. And how did Breslin know that he didn't get 6 months training there? He went to a school in Georgia where he was trained as a security guard. How does Breslin know he wasn't sent to the place where Mitchell Warbell trains assassination teams to shoot on site? Mitchell Warbell works with Turple and Coca-Cola and the Beirut, Lebanon assassination team set up by the CIA. How does Breslin know that he didn't get his training in Georgia before he went to Beirut? Chapman took a trip around the world. He was in Asia, he was in Europe, he was in Switzerland, he was in London. He was gone a long time. How does he know that he didn't get his training shooting in any one of those cities? And he worked for a year at Fort Chaffee in Arkansas, a military base. Allegedly, he was helping Vietnamese refugees because the news media had a picture of a child on his shoulders that he was carrying around. But outside of being photographed with that one child, was he at a rifle range? Was he trained at the military base? There are endless places in Georgia where the assassination teams talk about training private armies to get communists, niggers, anti-war protesters, and so forth, and they brag about training places all across the United States and around the world, and I'll read you some of their quotations. So Mark Chapman could have been trained in Beirut. He could have been trained in Atlanta. He could have been trained in Tennessee, where he lived for 1 year. We don't know what he was doing at these places. This one-shot group that Breslin talks about has nothing at all to do with the facts. And yet this is the kind of media trash that's thrown all over the world. Another article in the Chicago Tribune last week, The Four Faces of Lennon's Killer, the bizarre psychiatric portrait by James Junger, Y-U-N-G-E-R, out of Chicago. And he talks about this killer identifying with Lennon and how he wanted to be like Lennon and he wanted to destroy the original Lennon. But then when he gets into the article, he says that Chapman was in Arkansas and fled to Hawaii for unknown reasons. Well, as long as there's unknown reasons why he went to Hawaii, how can these situations be solved? He fled, so they knew he'd left in a hurry about something. There were earlier arrest charges that came in on the computer, arrest charges from March 1980 and also from 1972. So what was he fleeing from when he went to Hawaii, and who met him in Hawaii, and who gave him his job, and so forth? So the media is doing their job. They're supplying the motives. They're saying that his link to the Beatles was mystical, and so forth. And then there's another article, The Portrait of a Crazy Man, and it shows a person holding a tape cassette, Kiernan Crowley from Atlanta, Georgia, who claims that in 1975, Chapman mailed him a tape cassette, and when he saw the name, he just happened to get it out. This reminded me of Lee Harvey Oswald down in New Orleans making a record, I Am a Marxist, that was on television within an hour after John Kennedy was murdered. And years later, it turns out that he made the record with Ed Butler of Army Intelligence, who worked with Patrick Frawley and the Schick people out in California. He was a military intelligence agent who set up the cover of the communist Marxist Oswald to conceal his connections to Defense Intelligence Agency, the Defense Security Command, the FBI, and Navy Intelligence. The whole purpose of the record was a subterfuge to blame the communists. So out of the news this week comes the picture, The Portrait of the Crazy Man, and stories of the Lennon killer. We have to deal with these chief of police detective quotations. He's an apparent wacko, and this is a motiveless crime, the attorney said in New York. Everything has an easy solution, and if I have time, I'll go into some of the similarities. Another saying, ex-mental patient held as the killer. He was only a mental patient a hard time, but he had a lot more mobility than most mental patients. Being in a mental hospital like Castle Memorial Hospital for a few weeks or months, and then proceeding to be hired by that hospital to do their janitor work, to do their printing, to do their layouts, to hire his wife, and then send him on these trips. That depression that he had was very short, and following that brief little episode, he began that journey, as I say, around the world. I began setting up the different files. They get larger as the new information comes in. This past week, I've separated and continue to do it, the media lies or the cover story. Then the real Chapman, the picture that was finally produced when the news media admitted that up to that time they threw a blanket over his face. This was even in the newspapers, and I talked about it last week. That sweetie little cutie with a Beatles-type haircut like the War and Help, or Hard Day's Night, rather, holding the child on his shoulders. All of a sudden, people began to say he was mean and he was terrible, and his obnoxious personality came out. And then they finally produced the mugshot of the ugly face, and instead of calling him just downright fat, 200-pound fatso, they were trying to make him pudgy with his baby fat the first week or so. But I have copies of the false arraignment that hasn't been produced yet. I would like to see who it was they thought they had when the first arraignment came in on the computer, the same name, the same height, the weight, and locations. They have yet to produce that. And then where did he travel? I have a separate catalog on that. He went from Fort Worth, Texas, where he was born on an Army base, to Miami and Atlanta, and he stayed in DeKalb County in Georgia, and I'll go into that at length. Then to Beirut for a certain amount of time. Chronologically, he got out of high school in 1973 and was in DeKalb County at DeKalb Junior College for 18 months. And in the time period of 1974 was when he became a strong Jesus freak, anti-Lennon, wrote articles or notes on his book, I Am Jesus. He became a born-again Christian. The next year, Tony Adams of the YMCA sent him to Beirut, Lebanon for 6 months. And when he came home, he went to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, which is a Vietnamese refugee base. They were sent there. Now, the Vietnamese that left that country all were related, most of them, to the CIA. They were kicked out because they would have been killed for humanitarian reasons. They were allowed to come to this country. Many of them came with millions of dollars. Premier Key and Thu and others came out with a lot of money. He married a woman named Jessica, but so far the media has given her no last name or no identity. She's just Jessica. And that's the year 1975 when he sent the tape to a person saying, "I am crazy," and it stayed in the drawer. But I believe the programming began over in Lebanon, and I'll tell you why in this time period. He then went to Tennessee in 1976 to a Presbyterian college for 1 year, Lookout Mountain, Tennessee. And then in mid-76, the story is that he fled quickly to Hawaii. He arrived in Hawaii and wrote that he was taking care of old people. Where he worked isn't explained. There's no name of a place or a location. This also could be a time slot of the mind control programming. And the second half hour, I'm going into his art gallery connections and the mind programming in Hawaii. So there's a wide open time period here in 1976 from mid-76 till mid-77 when he goes to the Castle Hospital. He has a breakdown in 77 where he's at Castle Hospital, and again, a good time for mind control programming, erasing memory, suggestive controls such as the control of Candy Jones, another agent that was sent all over the world with double personalities. At the same time that he was at Castle Hospital, he had his wife. After he was there, he got a job as a janitor, and later he was in charge of their print shop and doing the art graphic work for them, the layouts. A janitor at Castle Hospital could also be a plumber, like the White House plumbers. In 1978, he was, in quotes, looking for something, so he took a trip around the world. There are discrepancies here about who paid for the trip. One article says an agency paid for it, similar to the YMCA, but it isn't identified. So it could be the AID, the DIA, the CIA, the DISC, the FBI. It's an agency similar, but never named. So the people he worked for when he first arrived on the island are not discussed, and who paid for his trip. Another article came out that his father paid for the trip. He was supposed to be disassociated and not close to his father. His new wife worked for a travel agency, and she made the route for his trip. Her mother and family also put up $5,000 along with his mother for him to buy a portrait of Abraham Lincoln to start his interest in the art galleries. Now, Abraham Lincoln's an interesting character to own for a person born in Texas, living in Florida, hardly a Yankee personality, and then from Arkansas and Tennessee and Georgia, working with some very mysterious people. It's interesting that his first picture is somebody who was killed by the assassination bullet also. Then he parlayed that picture for a Norman Rockwell, which is the American apple pie image, the perfect American image of what America should be. But his mother and his wife's family parlayed money into other art collections. One thing I just mentioned is that $7,000 that he got. Allegedly, he was separated from his mother because she was a strict disciplinarian. That's the way the cover story wants it for you. But in fact, the mother and the wife's family, still unnamed, not identified. We haven't seen in the news a picture of the mother. We haven't seen anything about the wife's family or where she comes from. But this ne'er-do-well loner was financed with art collections, and after his wife took a job at Castle Hospital to be near him, he left Castle Hospital to be near an art gallery. And it's at the art gallery where I believe that the control of his mind should be checked out, because art galleries around the world have been linked to the past assassination teams, the assassination teams of Beirut, and to the Atlanta, Georgia, Marietta, Georgia, heart of the conspiracies that killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. He was nurtured right in DeKalb County in Marietta, Georgia, for 18 months after high school before going to Lebanon. So after he left a job at the hospital and went to be a security guard, allegedly to be close to the art gallery. Now, there's another alleged arrest, March 19th, 1980, for an armed robbery, but the powers that be said, oh, no, we made a mistake. It's the same name, the same body, weight, description, and so forth. October the 23rd, he checked out of his job and signed that famous John Lennon name that I'm going to go into in a minute. In November, he came back to the United States from Hawaii for what the media called a quiet visit to New York. He also had a visit to Atlanta, Georgia in November 1980. He went back to Hawaii for a visit in December 1980, and then back to New York December 3rd. And he told them when he left Hawaii he was going to London. John Lennon was murdered December the 8th. And I'll go into the log where he signed the name and what happened to the log on December the 10th. So this is the chronology of a man. He was in Switzerland at Geneva visiting a friend of his from the YMCA, a man that he knew earlier when he was first sent to Beirut, Lebanon, who was now stationed in Geneva by the name of Tony Adams. And he went back to see him. And at the end of this first half, we'll take a break for 1 minute for those of you that have tape cassettes of these programs. Then we'll go back to the name Jerry Adams, and Mr. Jerry Adams of the Adams Associates Agency in Murrieta, Georgia. And so a little bit on mind control and Atlanta and Murrieta, Georgia, as the hub of the assassination teams, the people who would have the motive to kill John Lennon, and the links of this grisly character to those places. And I think if the investigators center on the apartment he lived in Hawaii, some people are doing work for me on that. Great work on, and I hope I have time to get into that this evening, the apartment house, who owned it, and the controversial links allegedly to organized crime and to the attorney of these people from organized crime representing Chapman's wife. You'll be able to see that the pattern of the assassinations that we researchers did with the other political figures follows pretty closely the John Lennon assassination. I'll take a breather here for 1 minute, and then we'll get back to the second half. Hi, we're rolling along pretty fast with a lot of names. Some of you are new listeners and not familiar with the names, the countries, and the places, but you can get a general overview. I tell people that if they're listening for the first or second or third time that if you pick up your newspaper and you read about Mr. Meese or Ronald Reagan's cabinet or Caspar Weinberger and these various people, they don't go into their background every single day. They have their names, and if you're interested, you have to go to the library or magazines and look up their background. They don't fill you in. They just tell you what they're doing that day, and that's all they can do. Now, one of the similarities to Lennon's murder and the Kennedy and the other assassinations is the dependence upon the psychiatric profile to nab this alleged assassin and say he was a loner or crazy. And last week in the same Chicago Tribune article I mentioned, there was this Four Faces of Lennon Killer. There was a quotation of psychiatrists trying to analyze this Mark David Chapman. Not where he went, not the places he traveled that I mentioned before, but just this crazy guy standing in front of the Dakota Apartments. And one of the psychiatrists was Dr. Robert Marvitt of Honolulu, and the other was Dr. Stuart Berger, a former professor of legal psychiatry at Harvard. And what they claimed was that one of the most important, this quote's, one of the most important hints of his state of mind was Chapman signing the logbook, John Lennon, that they thought he probably, they clarified with probably, identified with Lennon, and he may have had an identity crisis. They're now using the word alleged or probably or may have. They can't say it positively. But the psychiatrist had a headline article, the most important hint in the clue of the murder, why he did this motiveless crime, was he signed the logbook. Well, what happened to the logbook? Immediately after John Lennon was murdered, the news media, the New York Post, and New York Daily News, and all the newspapers had a picture of the signature, John Lennon, the one written October 23rd. And the man who manages the apartment, Joe Bustamante, had the press conference to show the identity crisis of him signing John Lennon. But when the police went 2 days later to pick up the log, they didn't take it right away and photograph it in the police department. The log was missing. So the most important piece of evidence that they were hinging on is gone. Why is it gone? Well, this fellow who managed the apartment said he didn't think it was important. But why didn't the police go after it that moment? Maybe it doesn't have his fingerprints on it. It reminds me of Lee Harvey Oswald's diary. It was produced in April of 1964, and Gerald Ford took the story of the diary to Henry Luce, and he put it on the cover of Time. And it was the most single important thing to show the mental state of Lee Harvey Oswald, that he was suicidal, like this Chapman, where it actually wasn't true. And they were going to hinge on his own writings to show how muddled he was. And it turned out that the original copy of the diary has never been seen to this day. It's 17 years later. And the original wouldn't have Lee Harvey Oswald's fingerprints. It wouldn't be linked to him. There's no reason to believe he wrote it. So that this log that they were depending upon to show his head is gone, and goodness knows if it was thrown in the ocean or burned or destroyed. But the picture of the ominous signature was mailed to me from New York, friends who subscribed to the tape in New York, and you see the handwriting there, and that was the big cover story. And then another friend up in the Bay Area called me immediately to say the San Jose News this last week, Friday, December 19th, had the story of the missing log, and it was also on the 11 o'clock television, but it hasn't been in any other newspaper this entire week. I take 10 a day, and I haven't seen any trace of it. Now, one of the clues, as I say, to his personality must be sought in the art galleries. There was some quotations this week about his having a yen for art galleries, that he liked to collect art. One article from Chicago again said he developed an obsessive interest in art, and he changed his job so he could be near the art gallery. And Newsweek tells about his collecting, borrowing money from his mother and his wife's family and buying these prints. And by late 1979, he was calling Pat Carlson, a saleswoman at the Waikiki Gallery, 3 times a week and talking to her hour by hour. And he quit his job at Castle Hospital and took lower pay to be a security guard where he could be nearer the local art galleries. Another similarity in all of these studies is that people like Emily and William Harris of the SLA, or Charles Watson of the Manson family, and various people take lower pay to be near the scene of the crime. Lee Harvey Oswald, who was trained in radar, electronics, language skills, allegedly moving boxes around some old book building at Dealey Plaza at the time. Kennedy's coming through town. People with multi-skills who could be working elsewhere take jobs to be near their control agents, or they're on assignment. So when I read about his calling 3 times a week to go to the art gallery and having money not only to travel all over the world to these countries, but to be in contact hourly, frequently with the art gallery, I got out the articles of sworn testimony of Robert Byron Watson. This was reprinted in a paper, the Hudson Valley Chronicle, in 1977. And in November 6, 1977, I did a tape. If you have that tape cassette, number 294, that goes way back 3 years now. I did a story of the art galleries, and these were the allegations of Watson. He came from Atlanta, Georgia, and he claimed that Larry McDonald of Marietta, Georgia, who's now head of the House of Representatives conservative bloc, the moral majority, the New Christian rightist group. Larry McDonald is a big official in the Birch Society, and he's closely associated with a Jerry Adams and Associates collection agency, otherwise known as the Great American Silver Company. And it also is the Magellan Art Galleries on Peachtree Road in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a front for the assassination teams, gun running, terrorism, and narcotic traffic. Funds for Congressman Larry McDonald come through the Magellan Art Gallery. And Watson signed some testimony that this syndicate owns this combine. They steal electronic equipment and components and send them around the world and get paid in gold bullion. And they're involved in Chile, Peru, Southeast Asia, Costa Rica, and so forth. There's narcotics traffic, gun running. But the assassination team, we're talking about killing Martin Luther King in March of 1968, a week before King was murdered. And he overheard this. He was working in the gallery. And one of the people he worked with is a Dr. Anthony Malik from Beirut, Lebanon, who works with the Arab terrorists who helped fund the Black September group, the assassination teams, again, that have been terrorizing Europe and recently have been linked to Frank Turple, George Kurkola, the CIA, and they're very active in Lebanon. In fact, their name was in the news recently in connections with links to Billy Carter, and the Atlanta, Georgia connections. They laughed at, this is the testimony and affidavit he filed in 1977. They laughed about the assassination of Robert Kennedy. It was real genius to make the American people believe that he was a crazy misfit. And this is what they're trying to pass off now. They said Dr. Malik is part of the CIA and his associate is Dr. Habash, working for the CIA over in Beirut, Lebanon, linked to Robert Vesco and the assassination teams. Now, the art galleries in Atlanta, Georgia, are the center for cocaine, narcotic traffic. And in 1977, he linked Senator John Tower to these assassination teams. And recently, I did radio tapes and broadcasts of Tower being the brother-in-law. His wife's brother is Samuel Cummings in London, who works with the assassination teams and supplies weapons for Frank Churchill and George Corcola. So the Tower's name, Atlanta, Georgia, and the area, DeKalb County, is where this Jesus freak, this person who turned against John Lennon in 1973-74, was going to school in this exact area of DeKalb County for 18 months. And then Mark David Chapman was sent to Beirut, Lebanon, and the art gallery group had their headquarters for assassination teams all over the world, but one of their big places was Beirut, Lebanon. So it would be perfectly logical in 1973 if they were getting ready. This is at the height of Watergate, and the Nixon administration is going to fall down. Ronald Reagan was the selected heir to the White House. I'd published that in 1972. So you had this team active in Georgia, active in DeKalb County, where Chapman was, active in Beirut, Lebanon, heavily financed, and also they bragged about their weapon training. They had affidavits that Byron Watson signed saying that they trained with guns, that they had places where they learned to shoot all over the country. And this is why I say that this Chapman fellow could have learned that military stance very easily here. In 1977, Watson wrote that Herman Ballard, alias Herman Jackson, told him about paramilitary arms. We have arms and munitions in every state. You can personally visit a hidden practice range and become familiar with the use of automatic weapons, machine guns, grenades, just in case commies or niggers get out of hand. So the art galleries were a place of meeting of assassination teams, and Watson wrote at the time that the syndicate visited these places and they took members out for lessons. They would blow somebody's head off and have them watch so they could illustrate how they better keep quiet or they'd get their own heads blown off. Byron Watson, Robert, went down to Chile then, visited with these people. He was doing narcotics traffic and then got caught and served time, and that's why he had these court affidavits. He claimed that they were locking him up because he and his mother had gone to the White House in 1970 to give all the information of who killed Martin Luther King and who set the framework for the murder of King and framing James Earl Ray. Watson was down in Chile where he met Don Carlos Morales in San Diego, Chile. His nephew is the head of the DINA, D-I-N-A, the Chilean intelligence system. Morales is the second highest, most official in the Nazi Chilean government. Watson wrote this in 1977. He's friendly with the highest officials of the CIA, including Richard Helms, the former director, and they're friendly with Walter Rauff. The U.S. Friendship with this Nazi colonel has continued since World War II, and he told how they killed Salvador Allende and put in Pinochet. Later, Jack Anderson has had articles about Operation Condor, the assassination teams coming out of Chile. And the people named by Watson, the Habash group out of Chile, and there's George Habash and a Fuad Habash. He passed away recently. The one brother passed away. The other one is in Beirut, Lebanon. And this Dr. Malik was a friend of Habash and brought this Watson fellow who wrote this article. I have about 30 letters from Watson about this that came out. He was writing to me continuously from about 1965 to 1968. And then I never heard from him again, and I called another friend in New York this week to see if he heard about him, and he never heard from him again, so I don't know where he is. But just this year, October 22nd, 1980, Jack Anderson was writing about mercenaries, the CIA, Dr. George Habash, and their headquarters are in Beirut, Lebanon, and schools for terror. So I don't see any reason why we can't ask the question. It's not necessarily so, but ask the question, why, if Spiro Agnew, the Defense Department, the Operation Chaos, were so against rock musicians and the rock culture, why couldn't we assume or look for the chain of command of this person, Mark David Chapman, being sent to Beirut after 17 months in DeKalb County with these very people, in this milieu of these people? Because it's these people that are the fundamentalists that have been linked to the assassination teams and Ronald Reagan. And that is one reason I felt so sure that I could say November the 2nd, just a month ago, that when Reagan comes in, it's going to be hard on the rock musicians. Everyone around him and the assassination teams, as I said before, has moved into place, and we have to follow these routes. Another link to Beirut, Lebanon was an article that I mentioned on other tapes from the Washington Post this in December, The Mysterious Connections of John Ellsworth. Now, that's an agent that worked for the Secret Service, the FBI, Internal Revenue, Drug Enforcement, the CIA, the Organized Crime Strike Force in the Eastern District of New York. He was at Altamont putting down the hippies and the rock musicians at the time of the stabbing of Meredith when that movie was made. I've talked about Helter Skelter, Give Me Shelter, the era of from the Beatles to Altamont. Well, Ellsworth was very much involved with the filming of the movie Give Me Shelter. He worked for the federal agents. He was involved with narcotic traffic of the CIA in Beirut, Lebanon. All of that was published in the Washington Post. So the connections of the anti-rock group of the government agencies in Beirut is printed in the Washington Post just a year ago, and the patterns of this particular character come through there. Now, as far as the mind control, he had that glassy stare. He had that glazed look we've heard about in every one of these political assassinations, and yet no explanation of where he got that look or what places he went to. And as I say, there's missing years, the 6 months in Beirut, what he was doing at Lookout Mountain in Tennessee, the first wife. The woman in most of these cases is the control agent, and Hawaii is a center of mind control programs. The story of these apparent wackos doesn't hold up to the actual mental state of these people. The news media tells us they're depressed, they have unhappy love affairs, and so forth, and yet you find the wife arranging his trip through a travel agency around the world, the wife sending him money for the trips to New York, buying him the art gallery pictures. It couldn't have been too bad a marriage, and the women stay in the background. We don't have anything on the background of Mark David Chapman's wife. I got a letter in 1974, that's 6 years ago, from Ed Sanders. He wrote the book, The Family, about the Manson family, and he knew that I was interested in the mind control centers of the CIA, specifically in Hawaii, because Herbert Mullen in San Francisco had done some mass murders here in this state. And Mullen was working at the Holiday Inn, and then he met a woman much older than him, and against his family's wishes, he flew to Hawaii, and he was committed the next day to a hospital controlled by the Army. And Lawrence Kwong, a fellow who shot into the window at KGO when Jim Dunbar was on the air a few years ago, then walked down the street and commit suicide. He was taken to Hawaii by a woman and then brought back to San Francisco with mysterious gun put in his hand. He was supposed to be in a mental hospital, but the gun was unregistered and they didn't know where he got it. And he went to a private detective many, many times and said he's been programmed with electrodes and he's directed to this radio station. And he couldn't control himself, and the detective hardly knew what he was talking about and didn't want to believe it. So he went inside the office and shot Ben Munson, then went down the street and killed himself. But he was taken to Hawaii. Mullen was there, and there was even a hint that John Fraser was there. There wasn't any proof that he was. That was another California mass murder. But Mullen and Lawrence Kwong were taken there. So I got in touch with Ed Sanders, and he wrote to me, this was 6 years ago, and he said he would send me a resume of Herbert Mullen in Hawaii, the summer of this was early, this is way before these other stories were breaking. It was at the time of the mass murders in Santa Cruz around 1973 or so. He said he's gotten many papers. Mullen was first institutionalized in Mendocino State Hospital in 1968 and 69. Well, someday I'll have to get a computer and put these through. Jim Jones was trained with mind control down in Brazil at Belo Horizonte with the CIA, and then came up to Mendocino and had hospitals and training places. I'll have to overlap the years. It was 1960 when Jones was in Brazil, and 73 when he got the property in Guyana. But he did have mental and physical facilities up in Mendocino in this time period, and Tim Stone was the head of the grand jury. He was a DA up there. Jim Jones was on the grand jury, and Tim Stone was part of the DA's office from Stanford. Mullen was institutionalized in Mendocino. He became a completely different person, and this, what I'm reading, are parts of documents and letters that Ed Sanders sent to me. He became a completely different person. He said you wouldn't even know who he was. And it was early 1970. He went to Hawaii with a woman named Patricia Brown. She said that she had to take him to Hawaii, and there was part of a Christian community, a church group, that they stayed in, according to Ed Sanders. And the minute he got into Hawaii, he was put in the hospital the next day. The family didn't trust her, but they said it was some kind of a religious thing, a convent or something there, and they picked him up, and he was plunked into this place in psychiatric treatment over on the island. He has thousands of documents on the Mullen case, and I never have gotten a hold of those. Sanders is back east, and I haven't been able to get a hold of them. But he mentioned the taking of these people to the Hawaiian Islands for this mind control kind of thing. He names the hospitals in Hawaii and the company of a woman. The most famous or most outrageous case of a woman is Leonard Keeley, K-I-L-L-E, that I've talked about on tapes before. Her husband, the wife of Leonard, committed him to a hospital in Boston for the purpose of experimenting and implanting electrodes on an imaginative normal brain. He was the original inventor of the land camera. They took his invention away from him, and it became known as the Great Polaroid Land Camera. They reduced him practically to an animal status where he couldn't think or talk. And when he sued the federal government and the doctors for implanting these electrodes, even in his court hearings a couple of years ago, they had to put wastebaskets over his head because the electrodes were so strong in the room. They can't remove them. They're still implanted. But his wife delivered him to this psychosurgery and then married the man that she was living with before they put him in the hospital. So there is a lot of information about Mullen that Ed Sanders have. I do have one letter he sent me from the state of Hawaii, Department of Health, Maui Mental Health Service, 121 Mahalani Street, dated June 26, 1973. And this is just the time that Mark David Chapman was graduating from high school and staying in an area that was very much involved with counterintelligence, experimentation, and assassination teams. Mr. Mullen was treated here as an outpatient from June 26, 1970 to July 10th. He reported he arrived in Maui June the 25th and sought voluntary admission the following day and was put in a psychotherapy group with the health clinic. And this is a report about his arriving and being given LSD and other drugs. And he had a desire, according to the state of Hawaii, to spread nonviolence. And they started administering Thorazine and Stelazine to him. His desire in the medical report or signed by the clinical psychologist was for nonviolence. And it tells about his being admitted into the place and later administering other drugs. I do have one area of research that was sent directly from Hawaii to Ed Sanders, and the chronology is interesting. The way the family didn't want him to go, he went, and the next day he was slapped into a hospital. That's why I say the chronology of Chapman going to Hawaii. We don't know who met him there. He had a wife. We don't know anything about her, whether she worked with the CIA, whether she was like Leonard Keeley's wife, whether she's like the woman that sent this poor Mullen over to Hawaii, or the woman that was with Lawrence Kwong. The pattern, the similarity runs through all of these various conspiracies, and all you have to do is change the name and the dates, and you find that the modus operandi remains the same. In 1973, there was an article here in California, mental hospitals versus patients who are doing killing. And it says 74 people have been killed in California the last couple of years by patients. Edmund Kemper, 8, Mr. Mullen, 10 or more, Juan Corona, 25, Oda case, John Frazier charged with 5, the Manson family, 5 deaths. In Houston, Texas, there was a ring of homosexuals and deaths, bodies being shipped to California, 27. Now we have the Stranglers, the Freeway Killers, DeSavio, the Boston Strangler, Jim Jones, David Berkowitz. The common denominator with all of these mass murders, there may be more mass murders, but the common denominator is that they all had links to the federal government, to the local police department. I do want to do one whole evening on the Strangler in Los Angeles, the links to the CIA, the FBI, and the local police department. Well, what is the motive behind all of this? We don't have time tonight to go into the motive or the modus operandi of mind control. But there is a reason for it. There is a good reason. It's documented. If I told you, you wouldn't believe it. If I read it to you, it sounds impossible. In the long run, the purpose to erase memories and to make people not responsible for their behavior is that the Earth, in essence, is overpopulated, and that the NASA space agencies, along with people from Nazi Germany who came to this country, designed a way to eliminate people. But in order to eliminate them, you have to control their minds to accept this process, and you have to create certain patsies to wipe out those political leaders who would be opposed to this kind of genocide. I have a book called The Doomsday Dictionary, taken after the Doomsday Dictionary, written by 3 psychologists and social workers that came out in 1963. And they talk about manned space stations that I'll go into later. They talk about siphoning the world population out, and the people working on the space stations right now talk about the necessity to genetically mutate and alter minds in order to make this feasible. If there's only a limited amount of the Earth's resources and there's too many people to bother to educate or house or employ, if robots will do it, there has to be an alternative way to handle it. I've quoted on the air many times the quotations of Dr. Jose Delgado, who works with these assassination teams very, very closely, and with Ronald Reagan's team and the far right. And the direct quote, in general, I just give you an idea of what it is. He says, man does not have the right to have the power of his own mind. Delgado has perfected the electrode implants and so forth because he doesn't believe in today's society that you know what is good for mankind, that there has to be an alternate way, whether they insert transponders into you or whatever, to control you. Now, there's some people that don't agree with Dr. Delgado. I don't think John Kennedy would agree. I don't think Malcolm X would agree. I don't think Martin Luther King would agree, or Robert Kennedy would agree. I don't think John Lennon would agree. And I don't think there are very many people left who care that much about society, who have the guts to stand up and point their finger at these people and accuse them of altering our life to become mechanical. John Lennon was one of these people who illustrated that their way was wrong and give peace a chance. Wars eliminate population. They also increase weapon systems. The chapter on Mark David Chapman is far from closed. More people are instantly working on this than they did a John Kennedy case or the other assassinations. A lot of people are angry. I appreciate your calls during the week. I'm getting flooded with letters. People are hurt. They're concerned. And maybe this is what they needed to shake them out of a certain lethargy and realize that It's out there. These assassination teams are perfected. They work. They got their coverage story going. So if they can put it over on us one more time, they'll try it. And it's up to us to say, we've had enough. And if you've had enough, just keep listening to KLRB, and we'll try to show the patterns of these crooks, thieves, and murderers as we go along. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and you take care. Till next.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.